Hello, my name is Courtney and welcome back to my channel. And today I'm going to be doing my August wrap-up as well as my Orilium readathon wrap-up. So I had a really good reading month, I think in part due to doing the readathon. It just really pushed me to keep reading, and I had a really excellent time doing that. It was a lot of fun, and I ended up reading a lot of really good books. So I'm going to go over the books I read, but I'm also going to go over what challenge I read them for the Orilium readathon. And yes, I did complete my set challenge, as well as doing some side quests. So first we're gonna start with the manga I read, and then we'll get into the books. So one of the mangas I read was Descending Stories, or Showa Genroku Ragoku Shinju. This is a Josei Seinen historical fiction manga. I think the time period is like the 30s, 40s through like the 70s, 80s, and it's basically following this one man's life and him kind of telling his story about being involved in this particular Japanese art, which is called rakugo, which is basically like a specific type of storytelling. There's like set stories and you do it on a stage. A lot of it is like comedy acting. I don't really know how to describe this. It's a very particular kind of hobby slash like profession, and so it's following this man's life as he tells his story. I watched the anime a couple years back and it utterly devastated me. It was one of the most amazing pieces of art I've ever watched, both from like an animation standpoint and just from like a storytelling aspect. This story is like really fucked up, but the way it's told is just so compelling. This is all about the art of storytelling, and so just the concept of a story being told by a storyteller and not him necessarily telling the story accurately or truthfully, and you having to decide what you believe and don't believe of his story. It's mind-blowing and it's crazy. This first volume, like the anime, is a little slow of a start. We're starting in the present time with another young man who wants to be a rakugo artist, and it's our main character kind of at an aging point in his life. So I'm really excited to get into the more historical fiction part of the story because that's where it really picks up. So I would definitely recommend the anime, but I want to get a little bit farther into the series before I recommend this series. I've already ordered the second volume and I hope that it continues to be just as excellent as the anime. So I read this for the quest of reading a morally great character because in my opinion, there's no more morally great character than this man right here. The next three mangas I read are all part of a series, and that would be the Haikyuu series. Since the anime announcement of the show being completed with 2 movies instead of multiple anime seasons, it kind of put a fire under my butt to really start continuing to read the series again. I'm a really big fan of the anime. I really love Haikyuu. I think it's one of the best sports animes out there. So I'm excited to be collecting the entire thing for the first time and reading the whole thing as a manga for the first time. So yeah, this was really fun. So I read the second volume, the third volume, and the fourth volume. The second volume I read for a quest, which was to read a book that had been adapted to a movie. This has been adapted into TV series, obviously, but there are Haikyuu movies, so I think it counts. The third volume I read for the most recent book you've picked up, and just because I couldn't find this one in the stores, it did end up being the last book that I had picked up because I had to special order it from the bookstore. And for the fourth volume, I did it for the quest of a book featuring a game. They say game a lot in this volume, which I thought was really funny, but yes, the game of volleyball. So now let's get into the books I read. And why not go from least favorite to favorite? So starting off, I'm going to talk about The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea by Axie Oh. This is a Korean historical fantasy novel, and it is a standalone YA novel. And it's basically following a young girl who decides to throw herself into the sea to be the sea god's bride to save her brother's lover. And from there, she falls into a magical world like spirits and ghosts and demons. And this ended up being just okay for me. I liked some of the tropes it followed, and I was really excited because this book sets itself up to be a coming of age story, really focusing in on this girl and her connection to storytelling. But to me, it was just a little bit too plot focused. And to me, the plot didn't really add anything to my enjoyment. In fact, it made me really slog through this book. I thought the romance could have been a little bit better developed because I didn't really care about the characters that way. And I thought this book had the problem of over-explaining some things and under-explaining other things. And so it was just a little bit of a confusing mess. And instead of like a whimsical fantasy, this was kind of a more over-explained, plot-driven fantasy, which would have been fine, but I don't think that the author was successful in what they were trying to do. Haikyuu. So yeah, it just ended up being okay. It wasn't like the worst book I've ever read. I gave it like a 3 stars. It like covers its bases, but it just, I think it could have been more. This was fine. It was good. And I read this for the challenge of a book with foil on the cover for my artificery challenge. And as you can see, it has like a little bit of red foil with the little string of fate. The next book I have is All Out, which is a collection of short stories by a lot of different authors, and this is edited by Sandra Mitchell, and this is the first in the All Out series. And these are queer story anthologies. This one is like all historical stories, all set in the past. I recently read the one that takes place in the present, and I was not impressed by it. I just thought a lot of the stories were too short, fell flat, didn't work as short stories, and I felt slightly similar to this one. I would definitely say that the first half of the stories appealed to me a little bit more, but the second half, the more I got into the book, the less and less I enjoyed myself. I would say for the most part, the stories were 3 stars. There were a couple 2s and a couple 4s, and you know, some that impressed me, some that I liked. I did enjoy these stories more just because it was set in a historical setting, and I really liked the theme of uncovering or sharing stories, kind of going to the fact that queer people have always existed. While there were a diversity of authors, I did feel like some things were missing. It was mostly taking place in Europe and America. I would have loved some stories set in some other places. I feel like we are missing some indigenous rep. We had a lot of ace rep, which I was really impressed by and excited for, but I would have loved to see more stories that played with gender, that played with time and place, and I especially felt like we were missing some stories from some disabled voices. So overall, this was fine. There was no story that really impressed me. The story that I gave the highest rating was The Girl with the Blue Lantern by Tess Sharp. This was a historical story set during the gold rush, and it was kind of magical, fabulous, fiction-y. So I'm gonna look into the author and see if she has anything, because that was the story that I liked the most. And besides that, I would say the first story and the last story were 2 of my favorites. I really enjoyed both of those. But overall, I could see a lot of potential from these authors. The authors definitely interest me, but I don't think a lot of them particularly were great at writing fully fleshed stories. I think short story writing is a lot harder than people think it is, and I fully trust that most of these authors can write a really amazing novel. So it was nice to get a taste of them here, but I wasn't super impressed by the stories themselves. And this I ended up reading for my second chance author, so that's kind of cheating because this is like an anthology series, so there aren't a lot of overlaps with the authors themselves, but I was giving myself a second chance with this series. I am going to continue and read the 3rd book because I do have it. Overall, I'm looking more at this as a way to expose myself to new authors than to necessarily enjoy the stories themselves, because I guess I have a high standard for short stories. I guess that's what happens when you read a lot of short stories for a creative writing degree. Next book I have is The Lesbiana's Guide to Catholic School by Sorana Rees, and I believe this is this author's debut, and I'm very excited and looking forward to more books by them because I really enjoyed this. It was really fun. I ended up giving this a 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, and it's basically the title of the novel. This young girl is going to Catholic school. There has been some situations at home where she doesn't want to go to her public school anymore. She is in the closet. She wants to stay in the closet firmly because she had some problems when she tried to come out of the closet to her best friend. And this was just really well-rounded. There was some cute, sweet moments. There were fun moments. There were really heart-wrenching moments and more serious moments. It was just a really well-rounded coming-of-age story. And I read this for a book with shrubbery on the cover. There are roses, rose bushes, roses grow on bushes. It's a little bit of a stretch, but I think it's okay. We're gonna say this is a rose bush. The next novel I read was a reread, which was My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craighead George, and this was for the challenge of reading or rereading a childhood favorite. I really loved any kind of books where the kid was living in the woods, any kind of survival stories. That was definitely my jam growing up, so it was so fun to read this, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it held up pretty well. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend it to kids today, but it was not a bad, disappointing read in any way. It's a really interesting story about a boy living in the woods, but it's kind of told almost in stream of conscious, almost in diary entries. It's a very interesting storytelling style. But yeah, I enjoyed it. It was good. I gave it like 4 stars. It was a good nostalgic read, and unlike a lot of other older titles, it really still works. The next book I read was Lore Olympus Volume 2, and this I read for the challenge of reading a novel, graphic novel, comic, which obviously this is. If you don't know, Lore Olympus is a webtoon that is now being published physically. I've read, I want to say through season 2 on webtoon, but I definitely have not been sticking up with it. I've been enjoying rereading it as a physical form. I will say I do think it lends itself a little bit better to a webcomic style when you have a lot of it to binge. It is just a very good series to like continuously read, but I'm still enjoying it in the physical form. If you don't know, Lore Olympus is basically a Hades and Persephone retelling where the present world, the human world, is kind of set in ancient Greek times, and then the Olympians are kind of in more of a present modern day society. And it's basically just a big romance between Hades and Persephone. A lot of people are very critical of Lore Olympus and do not like it. I understand the critique, I understand the criticism, and I try to keep those things in mind when I'm reading it, but I don't necessarily agree with all of the hate towards the series, and I do enjoy this. I like it. So for the next book, I have another quest book, and this was the challenge of reading a author with an F or a T for their first name, I believe, or maybe it was an F and an H, something like that. But anyway, I read Ace of Spades, and this book is by Farida Abike Amide, and this is a mystery thriller, maybe even slash horror novel. I don't tend to read a lot of thrillers, mystery type novels, but I was excited to read this. I love any kind of thriller that is like academia, dark academia, especially any kind of thriller mystery that's kind of deconstructing colonization, racism, any kind of that. I think horror, thrillers, mysteries lends itself really well to deconstructing that kind of stuff and having discussions and themes about different topics like that. And so I was really excited to read this. This takes place at a private school we assume to be in America, and the book mainly follows Devin Richards and Chiamaka, who are the only two Black students who attend this private high school. Chiamaka is a rich daughter of two Nigerian immigrant parents, whereas Devon Richards is a scholarship student from kind of the bad side of town. So when both of them start to get harassed by this mysterious figure called Ace, they don't want to quickly assume that it's racism, but things start to unravel. Things become a lot bigger of a picture than they thought, and things become a lot darker. This has a lot of trigger warnings for it. Racism, homophobia. This is a very, very dark book, and it deals with a lot of topics. So I would definitely recommend looking into those if you need some trigger warnings. I tried to cover the trigger warnings in my Goodreads review if you want to look there, but obviously there are lots of resources online as well as readers of color who have talked about this book. I really enjoyed it. I gave it a 5 stars. It was, again, dark, but it was very gripping. I was on the edge of my seat reading this, and I had no idea what was coming next, no idea how the plot would unfold, and I just read it in like 2 or 3 days because I had to know what was going to happen. I really loved these characters and this novel. Chiamaka is kind of like a queen bee, bitchy girl. The author in the back of the book talks about how she was really inspired by Gossip Girl and the main character of that, and I love myself a very bitchy, like prissy, queen bee type girl, so yes, I fell in love with her instantly, but I also really loved Devin and his story. So yeah, they just made for great main characters that I was really rooting for, and I just really, really loved this novel. I gave this a full 5 stars. I highly recommend this. Again, it is a very dark book, but in my opinion, it's really worth the read. And for my final book, and for the challenge of a book featuring AI, I read A Prayer for the Crown Shy, which features a robot and a tea monk becoming friends in a post-apocalyptic utopian type future. This is the second and possibly final book in the Monk and Robot series, and this is a novella adult sci-fi series, again taking place in like a utopian future, like a utopian optimistic eco-future, something like that. This is hope punk, hope sci-fi, so it's a really pleasant read, and it's basically just about a young tea monk trying to find their purpose, struggling to understand what they want to do and how to serve themselves versus serving others. I love it. I love this series. It was such a pleasant read. I read the first book this year too, I believe, and yeah, I love Becky Chambers. I love this. I have one more book by Becky Chambers to read before I've read all of her books, and I will continue to read her forever. She's like a must-buy author now because I've loved everything that I've read, and this was the perfect little short book to read for a readathon. But yes, those are all the books that I read for the month of August and for the Orilium readathon. I had a really great reading month, read some books on my TBR, read some new favorites, definitely books you'll see at the end of the year. All all in all, it was a really, really good reading month, and I'm so excited for the month of September to just continue this wonderful reading journey because I've been having a really great time. But thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you read this month, what you loved this month. I'll see you guys later, and happy reading.